In the EU, more of the focus has been on the access that users have to their data, how how you can control what is done with your data. Whereas if you really look at the approach that we have in the US is more around securing the data, protecting the data purely from a protection standpoint, and less on the access that is given to users to their data. I do find, looking at privacy in Canada versus the US versus Europe, that the Canadian approach is a bit of a middle way between the way the EU looks at it and the US looks at it. And maybe that's something worth exploring.
Hello everyone, I am Sergio Maldonado and this is Masters of Privacy, a set of interviews covering the intersection of marketing, data, privacy and technology with a clear goal in mind, which is redefining the relationship between people, brands and media around transparency and control. Which is to say, we're aiming for real customer centricity, or if you will, human centricity. We regularly talk to DPOs, CMOs, CDOs, and whoever else we find interesting and able to share valuable insights. So we hope you like it. Please do reach out if you have any ideas on future topics or speakers. Okay, we're joined by Stefan Greenweiss today, and he's a lawyer admitted to practice in multiple jurisdictions. It's pretty impressive. Also a privacy practitioner and DPO across the EU, the UK, the US and Canada for the past 20 years. His own firm offers outside DPO services for a number of companies on both sides of the pond, and he's also a partner specialized in international privacy at Outside GC, a US law firm with presence on the west and east coasts. Stefan teaches at various universities and writes for the IAPP Privacy Advisor. With him, we're going to have a second look at the differences between the EU and the US when it comes to data protection and how that transpires into data transfers after Joe Biden's executive order within that data privacy framework. And as we did in our last interview, we will take a quick look at the Canadian approach in case it can provide some inspiration. Let's get started. Stefan, thanks for joining us. Thank you.
No, I appreciate the opportunity, and I think it's great that we get to talk about what constitutes the differences in the approach to privacy between the EU and and North America, the US.
Yes, you're diving straight in. So please, give us a bit of an intro, please. Yeah.
Well, I mean, above and beyond the differences really in focus on what constitute privacy, which is different historically, and I'll go back to how it all started, I think. In my view, when you look at what built the entire privacy framework in the EU was really coming out of the Second World War, when we thought there were a lot of abuses by the government in occupied territory of personal information of users, of individuals, for a purpose which was really not intended by the collection at the time, which in order to discriminate people based on religion, race, and everything. A lot of the work that was done after the war was really on curbing the use that was made of that data by governments, and right or wrong, whether we write in that assertion or not, we feel that today the government is pretty much there to protect you. We trust government, and if there's some mistrust in what is done with the data, it's probably of corporations, what they do with our data. And I think that's, and if you kind of transfer that over to the US and you look at historically, a lot of the approach in North America is actually more on we don't like government. We don't like government telling us what to do, and there's a big distrust in government using your data. And for, again, a reason that is kind of tied to the history, we kind of feel comfortable with corporations handling our data. And so when you have a clash of those two systems, and you look at how privacy was developed in the EU, because we trust government historically has been governing the area of privacy by way of directives, by way of principles that came from the top down, where essentially we create a framework where we tell essentially what companies can do, not do, and we protect users. We think we protect users by way of those types of regulations. Now, if you go to the US, you see that there's very little interventionism when it came to privacy, unless we believe there's a major risk with the data. And in that case, we reactively pass legislation to protect certain categories of data in certain sectors and everything. And on the other side, we tend to trust the industry to self-regulate. We don't feel that the risk is at the corporation level. We feel that the risk is more the government misusing our data. So when you take those two systems and those two impressions, you realize that it's sometimes difficult to communicate. As a result of the development of privacy on both sides in the EU, more of the focus has been on the access that users have to their data. How how you can control what is done with your data. Whereas if you really look at the approach that we have in the US is more around securing the data, protecting the data purely from a protection standpoint, and less on the access that is given to users to their data. And it's interesting because in the context of transferring data from the EU to the US, there's a bit of a mistrust again that once it gets sent over to the US government is gonna protect the data the way that we do in the EU. But again, I personally think, and I don't know if you agree with me, Sergio, being yourself an expert in the field, that just because data is not protected using the same frame of reference that we have in the EU, it doesn't necessarily mean that it's less protected. It is protected differently because the approach is different.
Very good. What surprised me, if you want to start on one side of the pond, perhaps, is that we managed to agree on a common ground across the EU. Because even within the EU, the fact that the UK was part of the EU at the time that we had the GDPR and it was agreed, and we've got Germany, and I know that we've got a sort of Napoleonic, common civil code in the continent, so, Italy, France, Germany, Spain, but still, cultures were very different.
Well, we come from a common history, right? So yes, we are very different country to country, but our history is common. Historically, it's been a history of wars. So we are aware of what is it that brings us together, and I think that in a way, because I said a lot of the regulation is really coming from the top down in the EU, getting governments to talk to one another and agreeing to kind of force your way through parliament and the way things get done in the EU is actually not necessarily the path of most resistance. You would think that, governments can agree that we all have a common objective, which is really to agree what should be the principles around a certain set of terms. Now, if you look at the regulation, as you know, the regulation is not a normal regulation and is a political animal. Most regulations are automatically applicable across the EU, but if you look at GDPR is an imperfect regulation because it only handles 80% of what the law of the land is, and for 20% of those, it still leaves it up to the countries to decide, because we talk about fundamental rights, and what we talk about the Charter of Fundamental Rights, and that is common to all of the EU. So you can look at it this way and say, we do have a common history, we do have a common body of legislation, and what we needed to do moving from the privacy directive to the regulation is agree that instead of each country having its own way of looking at it, we would have a common way and only manage exceptions to a common law of the land. So I'm not that surprised, because I really think that coming out of a common history, we all have a similar interest in thinking the same way when it came to data floating around. Bear in mind, and I'm sure you can relate to this, we talk about the EU, we talk about countries within the EU, but in the US, if you look really at the US Constitution, we have a federal government whose really remit in terms of responsibility is always kind of residual to the one of the states. The states is really, unless the government at the federal level can justify legislating in those areas that are reserved for the federal government, all of the rest remains for the states. And there's a bit of a battle and competition between the state attorney generals wanting to get their share in the cake in terms of in terms of the privacy of the residents from within the state, and the federal government saying, well, at some point there's enough of an interest that is over and beyond the states and across border, and that justifies stepping in. But again, it is a lot harder for the federal government to do this. And I think when you talk about surveillance, surveillance exists in each country.
Yeah.
Let's be real. It does exist. Yeah. I think the concern and the perception that maybe the EU was having is that, well, it's not so much the activity of surveillance itself and the legitimate reasons why they would want to be able to have those laws, as much as whether you have any safeguards, whether you have the ability to oppose that and go before a court of law or oppose one of those decrees and all of this. I think it's more of the access to the ability to oppose that. Rightly or wrongly, we feel that, from an EU perspective, we do have more of the ability to oppose that if this were found to be the case in the EU. And again, we're looking at ourselves from a distance in the US. Do we have standard to sue and go there and oppose a mandate from the US government that would ask for that data? So I think it's not the issue of surveillance as much as how this is actually implemented and whatever recourse we have against any of the decisions.
Okay, Stefan, so now to take it into the business, right? Can we ever get to agree on common standards? Is it poised to fail no matter what? Or do you think that we really should just try, as you're saying, to try and understand that these are different approaches and that perhaps a US citizen in France, in Spain, would not, after all, get the same sort of redress?
Yeah, no, I think you're raising a good point. And if you really look at GDPR, again, it's more based on the concept of residency and not the concept of citizenship. Because if you have an American living in the EU whose data is collected, they will be subject to GDPR, because when the data is collected, it's collected in the EU. So there is a difference in the way that the law was built. However, I think there are, and by the way, I think we need to distinguish between FISA and Executive Order 1233, 333, because they have different scopes. And I think on FISA 702, you do have a number of checks and balances, which you don't have to the same extent under the Executive Order. But yeah, I don't think it's doomed, and I don't think we cannot find a way to give standard to sue to foreign users. The reason being that if you really look at executive orders, they allow themselves to also monitor the activity of individuals who are not necessarily based on US soil. So I think, and if you look at how that executive order, the new one that just came out, would work is by the US doing an analysis also of the system of surveillance in the EU to see whether they're comparable in one way or another. But what is really interesting in all of that, Sergio, is that this is coming at a time when we see the federal privacy law coming into a lot of hurdles because of the political situation in the US, which, in the face of that makes it somehow easier to kind of make decisions from the top down, because it's impossible to get to a point of agreement if we were to go to Congress and legislate at that level. So it's kind of interesting to see the timing of all of this as we are, reaching the midterm elections in the US as well.
Very good. Yeah, that's a good point. So all of these systems, everything in marketing technology, advertising technology, there's been so many pieces of technology that brands are using, advertisers, publishers, which are US technology, software as a service, and they've been relying on standard contract clauses. And after Schrems 2, we had this sort of additional burden. You had to, assess what was the impact of the transfer, and you needed complementary or supplementary measures, which in the case of the US pretty much sometimes seem to say that you had to outsmart the US government in terms of encryption. It got to the point that it was pretty bizarre. So where are we now? Because now, of course, the bar should be lower, since regardless of what the EU does, there's already an executive order that already says that they'll be more careful in the US. So do you think that's really good news per se? Should people still be skeptical, assuming there'll be a Schrems 3? Privacy Shield 2.0 will go down the drain, and we need a different system, EU servers, EU technology, as many people seem to be planning for that.
I think there's always been good intentions. The issue was never around the good intentions or not. I think the issue was more around how this is being enforced. We've always known that when data is collected from the EU, it's collected subject to the GDPR. Once the data is transferred over to the US, it is managed under the program of that whatever the US agencies run. And I think the problem we have with this is because the fact that you would have to assess the laws that apply in the country of export is also that, a lot of the discomfort that US companies putting pressure on the government to adopt a new privacy shield is because people have been quick to know that above and beyond the paperwork that is mandated by having to sign SCCs after SCCs after SCCs, when really, as opposed to rely on the privacy shield, is also that when you sign the SCCs, you are committing to protect the data and process the data in accordance with the law of the data exporter, which for many of those US companies means foreign law that they're not familiar with and creates additional burdens for them. It's a lot easier to say, I self-certify to a program in the US where ultimately if I mess up, it's all going to be under US law. I'll have to deal with US agencies and I won't have to necessarily commit to comply with European law. And I think a lot of it is, I personally, I am pretty skeptical now because I try to really, the adequacy findings typically get reviewed on a 4-year basis. When it came to the US one, it's on a yearly basis, and we knew that from the beginning. And it's not so much, do we have a process like the Shield that is comparable to the GDPR, as much as how much does the FTC do and the Department of Commerce to monitor that and audit those companies. And you don't want to be, again, it's the same thing. You're taking a federal agency having to certainly tell a lot of those economic players how to run their business and be there. And again, it all comes down to what should be the mandate of the federal government when it comes to data in the hands of the private sector. And I think this is where you have that tension. And I think to me, it takes more than just good intentions and statements of intent, the way we have them now. And I think the devil's going to have to be in the detail on how this is going to be working on a practical point of view. And I think we are far off knowing the details of that to speculate at this point, I think.
Does it make sense to you, perhaps, and this just came to mind, but that we split the privacy framework as it applies to private companies, corporations, and how the relationship between people and businesses, so that perhaps there's an easy way for companies to comply across the board. So California, Colorado, Utah, all of these state laws, and hopefully a federal privacy law. And there's certain things that will happen no matter what, either, whether you are in France or whether you are in Utah. There's certain things you can expect from privacy protection, and there'll be tiny little differences, but as it's happening with the global privacy control, opt-out, certain things start to look a bit the same, and even better sometimes in the US for how practical they are. And then a separate sort of framework for US and EU and whatever, and governmental data, or I'd say for governmental access to personal data, where it seems like we get into the political arena, it's much harder. If the political element hadn't been mixed up, perhaps we would have something that was running parallel to trade agreements that's happening with other countries. Does it make sense to you that perhaps we have a different treatment for surveillance? We can agree on what countries are doing and should be doing. Perhaps that's day trading.
Yes. As you know, I'm a European and a US, but also a Canadian privacy lawyer. And Canada has taken that path. Canada has actually 2 different legislations, one for the public sector, one for the private sector. And PIPEDA, which is really what served as the adequacy finding for Canada was actually treated very differently, looking at it from an EU perspective, than it is for the Federal Privacy Act, which is really dealing with public sector access to data. So yes, I mean, having maybe something that is focused on the industry and understands sometimes some of the constraints and the limitations and some of the user cases of private use to data, maybe one way to look at it, and maybe one way to get to a point of agreement that goes above and beyond that political arena here, when you have states fighting with the federal government in the US and never getting to a point of agreement, but how much can this be left in the end because who is ultimately responsible for the private sector? That's the problem, right? I mean, the federal government doesn't have that mandate. You can look at it by the state, every state looking at treating privacy differently when it's private sector versus the public sector. Why not? But I do find, looking at privacy in Canada versus the US versus Europe, that the Canadian approach is a bit of a middle way between the way the EU looks at it and the US looks at it. And maybe that's something worth exploring.
Maybe that's it. We'll follow the Canadian way. Thank you, Stefan. Thanks a lot. Thanks for joining us.
You're welcome. Thanks again, Sergio.
Okay, that's all for today. And you will find some episode notes and links to our social channels on mastersofprivacy.com. Thank you for listening.